folks, let's get started. I'd like to welcome you all here to the Ostrom Colloquium. This is our first paper-based colloquium of the semester, so thank you for attending, and also our first paleo-sponsored colloquium. Woo! So thank you for joining. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Cyan Loyal, and I'm the interim director of the Paleo program here at the Ostrom Workshop. It's a program that focuses on the political, economic, and legal institutions and organizations around issues of governance. So we cover a broad swath of research here and have a number of speakers that will be part of the colloquium series both in the fall and again in the spring. We are honored and deeply pleased to welcome David Bosco here as our first speaker. David is an associate professor in global and international studies and will be presenting his research today on the governance of the seas. His research focuses on the political dynamics of international organizations and international law, examining global governance, specifically the UN Security Council and the International Criminal Court. So we're pleased to welcome David today. Just a couple of rules about how we're going to proceed. There's a number of new faces in the room, so if you'll please just introduce yourself before you give your comments, that would be incredibly useful. David's going to get 5 minutes at the beginning just to contextualize the project for us and kind of talk about what he wants to talk about, and then we'll open it up broadly to comments and questions. We are live streaming, so the video will be available afterwards if anybody wants to refer back or to send the link to friends or family who would be interested in David's research. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to David, and please.
Okay. Thank you, Cyan, and thank you all for coming out. This is kind of the first public airing of anything associated with this book project, so I'm really grateful to you, but also a little bit daunted because I've been kind of, in my office just surrounded by books, and now suddenly you guys get to look at what I've been thinking a little bit. But let me give you a little bit of background, just as Cyan said, to kind of contextualize here in terms of my own disciplinary or lack thereof background and this project. So I am by training a lawyer, but the books that I've done to this point have ended up being kind of what you might loosely describe as legal/diplomatic history. And I think this book is going to fall into that category. This particular project then is under contract with Oxford University Press, and it's supposed to be, and this may explain a little bit of kind of the approach I've taken, it's supposed to be kind of public-facing, in the sense that it would be a book designed to, yes, speak to academic audiences, but also hopefully to speak to a broader public interested in these issues. And the way that I kind of came to this project was kind of similar to the way I'd come to my previous book projects, which was I just felt like there was a book missing out there that I wanted to have. So in this case, it was, there are tons of maritime histories. There are gazillions of books, most of which I have out from the library, on various aspects of maritime history. But I have not really found a good historically driven account of the history of maritime governance. And now that's a broad term, which, there are a number of subfields within that, but I'm trying to do kind of a diplomatic history of maritime governance writ large. And that's what this is then, is the kind of lightly conceptual chapter that will kind of introduce the broader book. The rest of the book, as I indicate, is going to move essentially in a narrative historical form up to the present day, with the aperture kind of, I'm never sure if an aperture widens or narrows, but the kind of chunks of time that I'm taking on becoming smaller as we move toward the present day. And obviously, there is a lot going on in the present day when it comes to ocean governance, and that was something that really drove my interest in this project, from the South China Sea to seabed mining, finally, perhaps becoming a viable industry, to new attempts to govern the high seas through negotiations at the UN. There's just a lot of stuff going on with the oceans, and I think that provided kind of the impetus for this project. I will say that you see the argument that I'm trying to make here. The argument kind of came as I envisioned writing a general history of maritime governance, And the argument kind of emerged to me as I engaged in that history. I think I would say it's not, and Scott, who has a great chapter on this, would acknowledge it's not a new argument for people who are kind of specialized in maritime issues. There's been a lot written in maritime circles about kind of the move toward national appropriation of the oceans. But I think what I would hope to contribute is the kind of fully fleshed out history. And I think for the public, for the general public interested in these issues, I don't think there's really been a grappling with the degree to which freedom of the seas, which certainly I think resonates broadly, but particularly to American audiences, is really becoming narrower. And I think that's often lost in the public debate. And I hope one of the contributions I can make here is kind of bringing that reality to the public debate so that there can be a more kind of grounded discussion of many of these oceans issues. And so I think I might just leave it there and let people rip into it.
All right, sounds great. Who would like to offer first comment?
Okay, so I thought this was fascinating, and I learned lots eventually the freedom of the seas and just what that means. But what struck me was very similar to a series of papers that Alex Salter at Texas Tech has written on space property rights and things. So I'm wondering if there's any connection to what the debate was going on with that right now. I think, in fact, one of Alex's papers is directly on the United States wants to do this to kind of promote commerce in outer space in the future, but it's in direct violation of some of the treaties that they've signed internationally. So I was seeing a lot of kind of parallels there. His solution, though, which I'm not saying is this the right one, but do you see any kind of his is that private law should be taking much of the slack within outer space, and so that maybe kind of question this as well with the law merchant. I know there's kind of a modern day version of this. How much of private governance is kind of interacting here? And is it possible, and how much of the slack can it pick up, I guess, was the few questions I had there.
Maybe I'll respond kind of now. And then,
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. So I think there's a lot, and Scott, the chapter that I cite in here, also has some interesting connections with cyber. And so there are a lot of these kind of commons areas that are kind of grappling with similar issues, and space certainly would be one of them. And I think I need to engage more with those literatures, because to be frank with you, I don't know those literatures well. And so space law is kind of its own area.
It's out there. It just sounded
it's out there. Yeah.
It sounded very similar to what your story is. It's just, there's differences, but it's.
But conceptually, I think I need to draw on that more, and there's a couple other areas of literature I need to draw on more. Now, the private law aspect is interesting because there is this stream. I mean, what in legal circles you call like admiralty law, kind of the private management of things that happen on the oceans is an important part of the story, and so is kind of self-regulation, I think. And in some of the historical chapters, I get into that quite a bit. But ultimately, when it comes to the big questions of what's the regime that overlays everything, it's hard to avoid those fundamental public law questions.
I don't think you can detach it, right? It sounds like it's a conflict issue, right? This is so the states are the ones fighting over this.
Yeah.
But I guess what I'm wondering is how much of the private governance plays into this, because I imagine a lot of the individuals engaged in these things will kind of, in dealing with each other, deal more with private courts rather than turning to the state. Obviously, your opening story, right, where it might have been private individuals who were out there in the sea, and then people came and they called for it. The government came. The government came, and so then they were like, well, we can't go to our private courts to deal with the government attacking us, so they went to their government. So I do recognize you can't. It's not going to be let's just turn everything to this, because the issue is in and of itself one where the states are fighting over this.
Yeah.
But I also find it hard to believe that it wouldn't be playing some kind of role, at least in interacting between citizens who might interact and come into conflict with one another.
Yes. And the areas that I think of immediately when you think of the salience of private actors is governance of shipping. And what are the rules on shipping, and how do shipping companies operate, and all of that for a substantial period of history, a lot of that was done just through private actors, without public authorities really being that involved. And some might argue it was done reasonably well in certain ways. The other area, though, is seabed mining, where you've got a lot of private companies that have eyes on the deep seabed, but they are going to be working in an environment where it was a public law choice or public sector choice about what regime is going to apply to the deep seabed. And so, so they're interacting within the boundaries of what has been determined at that public level.
And they may even be asking for it. Because they want,
they want clarity.
They want clarity. And even maybe to restrict competition in some ways by relying on the state to do that.
Please.
Thanks. I love this project.
Would you introduce yourself too? Just
hi, I'm Jessie O'Reilly. I'm an international studies colleague of David. So I love this oceans project. I'm really excited to read the entire book. Was happy to get a glimpse of it. I have a bunch of notes for you in here about Antarctica and common heritage of mankind and liability and all of that. The questions I wanted to ask you today, I have three. One is just a clarification one. There's an assumption that the U.S. is the leading maritime power. What makes us so, and who else claims that? Second are sort of a set of environmental questions. One is about climate and the ocean as a carbon sink, and I can't remember what the word you used was. Oh, seas as a conduit, sustenance wealth. So I was wondering what you've come across there. Particularly, it's like a solution to an energy crisis or solution to climate change as a carbon sink, and then mining stuff. The technology it's just science fiction. The technological advances for deep seabed mining. And then my final question is a conceptual one, and it's about freedom. And I'm wondering if the sort of free market and the freedom of the seas are the same thing. And then there's the I think Carnival Cruise Line that's talking about freedom of choice. Are they borrowing from each other conceptually, or are these competing conceptualizations of freedom?
Okay, so in turn, and I think they got progressively harder.
I know.
So the assumption that the U.S. is the leading maritime power, it's true, that does run through this, and I think this is going to be in part a U.S.-centric story because I think that potential conflict between the need to restrict freedom of the seas is particularly salient for the U.S., given how much freedom of the seas resonates in terms of U.S. rhetoric and public kind of statements and historically. But why would I say the U.S. is the leading maritime power? It is still the only global navy. It is the only navy capable really of operating globally, controlling ocean space on any regular basis globally. And so I think that's a kind of military-centric version, but I think that would be an important part of the reason I would say it's the leading maritime power. The other one would be its shipping role, but here things are somewhat, the whole phenomenon of flags of convenience has really complicated the assessment of shipping. Because, back in the 1800s, you could say, oh, Britain's the leading maritime power because look at how much of the world's goods are shipped in British vessels. Now, Panama and Liberia and Honduras are leading shippers in that sense. But if you look at the beneficial ownership of so who beneficially owns the shipping, still the U.S. is a major player, if not the leading. So I would say it's a combination of the military dimension and the economic dimension measured in terms of who actually owns. So that would be the answer there. Oceans as a carbon sink, it's interesting that you bring that up because I was talking this summer to some scientists who worked on this issue. And there has been the idea of the oceans as a solution to climate change, primarily in terms of iron fertilization. And the idea being that if you fertilize the ocean with iron, you dramatically increase its ability to absorb CO2. And so there have been a number of experiments with this. Some of them really dramatic, like the vessels would go out, they'd sprinkle the iron, and like the ocean changes color, and it's really dramatic. From a governance perspective, though, it becomes a fascinating question of, is that part of what you're allowed to do on the ocean? Presumably within a country's exclusive economic zone or whatever, there would be restrictions, but on the high seas, the norm has been freedom of research and freedom to do this kind of stuff. But there are several relevant conventions. There's a London Dumping Convention, and there was an important addendum made to that to deal with this question of ocean fertilization. The latest that I've heard from scientists working in this area is that it seems to be less viable, and so its allure as a potential solution for climate change seems to have waned considerably. So that's taking a little bit of the pressure off of the potential governance problems. The free market and freedom, and different ideas of freedom. Yeah, this is a part I really struggled with, was freedom of the seas really is kind of a slogan that's used often more than it is a coherent philosophy. I've tried here, drawing from legal instruments, but also kind of from political realities and diplomatic realities, tried to come up with a working definition of the different components of freedom of the seas. I don't think free markets is necessarily encompassed. I don't think there's anything about freedom of the seas that necessarily requires free markets. It does require free passage of goods. So the oceans have to be open as a conduit, but you could have a fully state-run economy with no free market, as we would normally use that term, that is then engaged in using the oceans as a conduit for trade. So while certainly historically the way it's developed, I think they have been quite intertwined. And there's interesting historical, if you look at when Britain left mercantilism, it was actually kind of coincided with when they embraced freedom of the seas as a real, something they wanted to defend. So that is kind of an interesting historical, but conceptually I don't see there being any necessary link between free markets and...
Great. Can I just add on real quick?
Yeah.
The MPA, you talked about marine protected areas.
Yeah.
Are you going to elaborate that a little more in the book? Because it felt like it was mostly a restriction here without talking about the environmental protection piece.
Yes. So there's, in the last chapter, marine protected areas have become a thing relatively recently, particularly the idea of having a marine protected area that isn't just part of a country's exclusive economic zone or territorial waters, but goes into the high seas. And there's some legal fancy footwork you have to do to get an MPA to cover the high seas. But several states have tried that. So yes, that's going to be a pretty prominent feature, and actually some of the folks who are helping me with research are actually diving into MPAs pretty heavily right now, because one of the latter chapters will talk about that a lot. It's true, just on this point about, I kind of mean to be agnostic as to whether freedom of the seas is something that we want to defend, or whether it's just this inevitable process that with any common pool resource you kind of have to get to something that moves away from freedom. So I guess I'm trying to be agnostic on whether these changes are good changes or not. But it's true, the way it comes off is like a restriction on freedom rather than a positive benefit. So,
Sarah, I have you on the list, and I'll get everybody else to.
Okay, great. Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Bowerly-Jansman. I'm also in international studies. I'm a political scientist by training, and my questions would have revealed that, even though I didn't announce it. So I'm going to push you a little bit more on this freedom, conceptualization, and theory. And I'm sorry, I walked in a couple minutes late, so I didn't get to hear your spiel in the beginning. So I'm interested to know who you are hoping to read this book and what you want them to do with it. Because as a political scientist and particularly a scholar of international relations, I really struggled with framing this as freedoms. I understand freedom of the seas as an important historical and contemporary slogan, which also I think Jesse is right to kind of pick up on free markets, because I think that some of the sloganeering around freedom of the seas echoes some of the sloganeering around free markets.
Mm-hmm.
To me and other IR scholars, I think what this is really about is, I mean, not to take it to too high a level, but anarchy versus order. And so I kept one like that when you were talking about freedom of the seas, I was like, oh, he's talking about anarchy. And when he's talking about curtailing freedoms of the seas, he's talking about imposing order in different ways. I found that to be particularly true when you mention that, you know, your argument is that the high watermark of freedom of the seas is basically the Pax Britannica, right? and any IR scholar is going to read this and be confused as to why you are talking about this in terms of freedom, rather than wrestling more with ideas of order, or at least a more thorough kind of discussion about the relationship between how you are conceptualizing freedom and order. And one of the ways in which I think that kind of it's like one of the reasons why I think it's important to sort of wrestle with this more and think more carefully about this conceptual and theoretical issue is that, for instance, you kind of have this throwaway line at one point, if I can find it real quickly, about how there have been an increase in, there are more international courts and tribunals than ever, including one specifically devoted to maritime issues, but there's no consistent enforcement authority that backs their decisions. There's a huge literature in political science in IR. I would especially turn your attention to Sarah McLaughlin-Mitchell, who has done a lot of work on mediation in interstate disputes, particularly around water. And so when I see something like that in there, and it's sort of like, well, there are these courts, but they don't really do anything. There's a lot of research that say that they do something, right? And so by thinking more about order and governance as multifaceted, I think that there's some more that you can unpack there that would really strengthen your argument and make it more accessible to at least to those of us working in IR.
Yeah. So one of the things I did say while you were not here was that I am trying to write this as a public-facing book, and so I want this to be picked up by somebody who's interested in the oceans, South China Sea, and is not an academic, not a lawyer, not a political scientist. So what I feel like I'm struggling with a little bit is how to do an introduction here that kind of gives the overall argument, lays out some concepts, but does not drive away the general reader. And so, yes, there are a ton of more specialized literatures that I can deal with, and I guess what I'm trying to figure out is how much I can deal with them. Now, that question of anarchy versus order, though, is really important. And I guess I'd push back a little bit on your pushback, because my conceptualization of freedom of the seas has an element of order imposition. It's not just negative. It's not just don't interfere. It also has this element of order through particularly the suppression of private violence at sea. Like, for there to be a meaningful freedom of the seas, there has to be a suppression of that violence, and that has to be done by actors, probably sovereign actors in the system. And so I would say that my notion of freedom of the seas has an element of order in there. And so the ideal type of freedom of the seas is not anarchy. It's free commerce, free use of resources, but also some imposition of basic order. But I agree that anarchy.
I mean, you get at it a bit with when you start to talk about negative versus positive conceptions of freedom. And I want to give you time to have other people ask questions, but I would just say that I understand that tension, especially with this being a forward-facing book. But I think doing some more to sort of unpack and tie that idea of freedom to things like order and governance a little bit more concretely, because I think that especially if this is a book directed towards a lay audience, people come to, will bring to the table their own preconceived, ideas about what freedom is, and I think most people think of freedom mostly in terms of negative freedoms, and so I think that that's where there's a little bit of slippage.
Yep.
Scott.
That was awesome. Yeah, maybe just building off of that, considering. Hi, Scott Shackelford. I'm a professor here at IU and director of our cybersecurity and internet governance project, who's also been suffering through way too many literatures on commons governance lately. So I'll keep it short. But responding to the freedom of the seas thing, maybe it's just as simple as clarifying that freedom of the seas is not the same as open access, even though popularly you get beyond a certain point and it's just let's gamble, let's do whatever we want. That's not exactly the case, right? So maybe clarifying, what do we really mean by freedom of the seas? What's the end goal there? Just a few quick points and then just a question. How broad is something I've struggled with as well, and I was wondering, maybe instead of going through a long kind of comparative case study comparing Antarctica or outer space, maybe it might be enough just to pick up on a thread, and maybe it's the common heritage idea, talking about how Johnson and Nixon were really supportive of this concept, starting with Reagan and the Moon Treaty, we really pulled back from it. And now looking with President Obama signing off on the National Space Act, I think it was called, 2 years ago now, that is kind of full circle now, back away from this idea of the CHM. And maybe there's a parallel there to what we see going on in the oceans that could be useful without having to go through the whole rigmarole of going through the entire history there. It might also be good, because you were talking about the private law conversation was interesting to me, maybe bringing in some of the Arctic Council stuff at least, and the extent to which these regional clubs are forming to help with governance. You probably do that in the chapters already, but not using terminology like polycentric since it's for a lay audience, but at least people understand clubs, and clubs of countries, like-minded countries sometimes getting together. That could be useful to kind of build out a bit. And then the question is, two quick ones. Thoughts on the future of International Seabed Authority? It's been pretty bullish from what I've heard just offhand with the new Secretary General, this new mining code of conduct. People seem to like where it's going, but then I also hear some pushback against it, and the fact that this whole CLCS process really underfunded, that's kind of undermining the legitimacy of it a bit. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on where that's going. And then a really easy one, was Selden right? Given what you've done with Grotius, what we're seeing now, what do you think on the future of closed seas? Are we really headed in that way, and what's the world going to look like as a result? That's probably where you end the book, but I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay,
dump,
those are great.
over.
Thank you. So the International Seabed Authority is such a fascinating and understudied governance.
Totally is, right?
I mean, in theory, this, I think I say something like that in here, but this office in Geneva, in Jamaica, has authority over more territory than any sovereign.
Yeah, right.
So I mean, they have the authority to give out licenses to mine, and it's a fascinating governance experiment. My feeling about it is that it still effectively hasn't been tested, because until seabed mining becomes viable commercially, it's all kind of in the abstract. I mean, yes, they're coming up with codes, they're coming up with environmental steps that they think are appropriate. They, a bunch of countries have kind of licenses to explore, to do preliminary work. But until countries and industries are making money off of this, I feel like we won't know how this is going to work. And it seems totally within the realm of possibility that it all goes to pieces. Not least because the U.S. is still not a member. So far, they've been able to skirt that problem. The sites that the U.S. privately has identified, that the U.S. unilaterally has identified, don't conflict with the ISA sites. Right. But it could happen, and so I view it very much as this fascinating governance experiment that is kind of in amber, essentially, until the free market melts it or whatever.
We finally have dinosaurs.
Yeah, and then we have dinosaurs. So I think Selden was right.
Yeah.
Which was the kind of the title of your chapter. Selden, the main, often cited as the main interlocutor of Grotius, view was, hey, why can't, Grotius's view is you can't occupy the oceans, you can't make it territory. Selden's view is why not? And I would say technologically, it's becoming more and more apparent that you can do control of ocean space in ways that you couldn't do before. And I think, so I see that logic as continuing. And with UNCLOS being this kind of desperate attempt to hold the line. Right?
Yeah.
Like, the state wants to expand seaward, and can we just hold the line here? But then you start to see the dam breaking, like in parts. And, whether it's the conversion of exclusive economic zones into things that are more like territorial seas, or the use of the extended continental shelf, which was allowed for an UNCLOS, but is been taken advantage of much more aggressively than was expected. You start, so you get this feeling of the kind of the cartoon dam with like, and I don't know that pressure can be held. So I guess my short answer would be yes.
Yeah. By the way, I love the chapter. I forgot to say that first, but it's great. So
thank you.
Angie, I think you're in line next.
So I had just a couple comments since this is designed more for people like me. So sorry, I just forgot. I'm Angie Raymond. I'm the director of the program on data management and information governance. And I'm also with the Kelley School, and I teach international trade. So, so I read this, and I do international trade. So and I'm a lawyer, so apologies for that. I apologize all the time for people. So, for me, so I liked reading this, but as chapter 1, I found it distracting, or maybe I wonder how you'll deal with this later. You throw out terms that are very specific, that come from very specific governance aspects of the sea, without explaining to them the trade-offs that happen when maritime law was created, or when. So, and to me, that is the pushback. Why not? Why not allow states, to control regions? Why not? Because we gave up that opportunity a long time ago to allow international trade to happen. Because the United States builds a false wall somewhere around its country, which, by the way, we do. Does that mean in the air and the sea? Does that mean that we get to blow craft out of the water when they come too close? We do, but for military purposes, not for trade purposes. And so so it's, for me, freedom only arises when individuals or state actors agree to give up a right they might otherwise have to allow people to behave in a way that might be more culturally appropriate for themselves. And because you don't specify some of that, like when you start talking about maritime law and how it is that we just all came to agree this is the way that we will behave in this particular area. When those agreements are made, we're giving up some authority and power that we have, either through military, economic, whatever it is. And that's how we, in my opinion, in international trade, that's how we give up freedoms. And so because you throw admiralty, maritime, fishing, all those things come from different places and a different fundamental idea that stands behind them. And so what that does then is this packs this chapter so deep, so quickly in chapter 1, that I wonder if you're starting at too high a level, and this isn't, chapter 3. And chapter 1 is what is admiralty law? What is maritime law? Where do those conceptualizations come from? Because those laws were created through giving up military and economic authority that we may have decided to exert, but nonetheless we decided to let the seas be free. And because that isn't chapter 1, you get in deep really quickly, and it bothered me. And that doesn't mean it's wrong. Maybe it's the way that law, freedom. Maybe that's the way you want to conceptualize it. But to me, as a lawyer, I'm like, maritime law and the law of fishing are different, and they come from different agreements that we made. That if we all fish all of the fish when they happen to float by the United States, someone else is getting screwed. So, and that's a totally different aspect of governance than I will not blow your ship out of the water for merely sailing a few inches into my territorial waters. In addition, that implicates not just oceans and seas, but it also implicates inland waterways. When you start talking about fisheries, you're talking about inland waterways, you're talking about environmental stuff. And as someone who went to law school in Louisiana, this is a huge issue of where that magic line is. And so the local Coast Guard can pick up someone up to here, and then they got to call somebody else, and then it becomes the high seas. And so, I would push back if you don't, in my opinion, if you don't start the book with helping define some of those parameters and saying, I see this, I want to look at the broader strokes or whatever it is. You're missing some key aspects of this. So Selden, why not? Because it won't work. Because it won't work in certain areas of it can't work for environmental law. It just can't. Because we as the economic powerhouse will destroy the oceans. We will literally destroy the oceans. I have no doubt about it. If the Americans can pull it off, we'll do it. We have, anyway, so that's a personal opinion. Apologies. But our pollution doesn't just stop where our magic line stops. So, Selden, why not? Because a long time ago, we agreed not to let that happen, not to have these magic lines.
Yeah.
Because why? Because of us. The other thing I want to push back on is you said military and economic was how you define what is the maritime powerhouse. The courts in London would fundamentally disagree with you on that, and you're lawyers, so you understand that law influences greatly interpretation of everything. And the English courts and the English insurance is what's used for maritime. And so not considering that idea as an influencing factor and just relying on power, either economic or military, is very American. Very, very American. And is convenient in today's environment when the armies, it's just convenient today. I think that power structure is shifting in terms of military and economic, and I wonder if that changes your argument completely. If we're suddenly not the powerful. So, I wouldn't limit it to those two dimensions, I guess I would say. There's a huge influence into what court systems are interpreting these conventions, whose insurances are commonly used. The English law is primarily used in all of this stuff. It's not the law of New York. So that is a huge influence. That's just, a Brit will read that and just go, and it will stop reading. It is literally like...
There aren't that many of them.
Yeah.
David, you've got 4 more people on the list. Can we collect some
Yes,
more?
yes, for sure.
Let's do a lightning round.
Let me try to...
Go ahead.
Right, my name's Joe Ryan.
Thank you.
Sorry. And SPIA has me teaching a course in international economics where I emphasize international conventions, organizations, institutions that deal with economic issues. One module that I think I mentioned this, we talked on the phone a couple of years ago now. One module that I've been thinking of developing was actually on the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, the migratory species management mechanisms that nations have created here, there, and elsewhere. One module that I do include in the course is on CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. And I guess my question is whether these existing mechanisms are already part of the picture in terms of managing the seas. The law of the sea I don't know much about, but put it this way, supposing the world's oceans were incorporated into the territories of sovereign states. The other sovereign states have already revealed in terms of like endangered and migratory species that the point that was made here, that things that happen in the sovereign space of one state affects the others, and so there should be limits and mutual agreement on things that affect migratory or endangered species in particular. So just the fact that it will become private or sovereign doesn't necessarily make it disappear from the landscape of everyone else. So I don't know.
My name is Adam Liff. I also teach in SGIS and primarily work on East Asian international relations, Chinese, Japanese defense policy, and U.S. strategy toward the region. So I read this also in my background is in political science. So I read this with 3 different hats on. One as an IR theory, recovering IR theorist. One as an international security guy. and third as a China hand. So I'd be happy to offline give you comments from all three perspectives, but let me just begin by saying I'm very excited about this project. As you know, I think this stands to, particularly at a kind of publicly accessible level, make a huge impact on a very important issue. So I applaud you for taking it on. Sarah stole most of my thunder with the comments about there are vast literatures in political science and international relations theory that you're not directly engaging. And whether you directly engage it in print or not, I think it might be helpful to at least engage it. It might actually help you think through a lot of these issues. There's a tremendous amount of overlap as it concerns related matters. And so I want to just make one comment and one question, and offer one question to you. First off, just definitionally, when you talk about control, you talk about domestic control, international control. I think you're talking about control in an international legal sense. I don't entirely know what that means because I'm thinking about control from a military perspective, which means something very, very different. So I would just suggest that you clarify that. What are you talking about? Because then I'm in a better position to evaluate, the extent to which I agree with you and your claims. So that's just a general comment there, because the word control appears throughout. And when I work on East China Sea, South China Sea issues, there are issues of control, both in terms of international law, but there are also administration. Japan administers the Senkaku Islands. The U.S. recognizes that, but does not take a position on the issue of sovereignty. So it would help me better understand where you're coming from. I will hold all comments on the China-specific matters to an offline discussion, but I wanted to build off of some of the comments that Sarah made earlier. And I think fundamentally one of the questions this project is engaging is one that's central to a lot of international relations theory, which is, as it concerns international law, does international law need an enforcer to be effective? And so when you talk about Pax Britannica versus what's happening today, how much of what we're seeing now is, I'm not making an argument here, I'm offering a question, is the order really hurting? Is freedom of the seas on the decline because the U.S. is not willing to back it by coercion when necessary? And specifically, you talk about U.S. refusal to ratify UNCLOS, or more specifically, Republicans in the Senate refusal to ratify UNCLOS. But it's more than that. So you referenced the 2016 UNCLOS judgment ruling, International Tribunal Law of the Sea, and the Philippines basically backing away from it, and you make the argument that it's basically, implied is that China, because it's so powerful, and the Philippines, because it's so weak, they basically just kind of set it aside, or at least the Duterte administration set it aside. What's not mentioned, and I'm not an expert on this specific fact, but I've been in a lot of rooms where people have raised this, is that behind the scenes, the Philippines has been begging the United States to take a stand analogous to the stand that the U.S. took on the Senkakus, and the U.S. is not willing to do it. So the Philippines is kind of left on its own in this case, where it has an alliance mutual defense treaty with the United States, but the U.S. is at best ambivalent about whether it applies to these particular areas. And so that's something that I think you, at least to the extent you engage that case, should address. And again, that comes back to this idea, or this question of whether international law needs an enforcer to be effective. And so I will just stop there.
Lee?
Yeah. So I think with all of these issues of commons areas, anytime we restrict, and this has come out, so freedom of the seas is a strange term in the sense because to get it, you're restricting piracy.
True.
So if we go back to Coase and then, Lynn Ostrom and a lot of recent work by Henry Smith at Harvard, he's in the law school, teaches property. So the advance Henry's made is on several fronts. One is to think of property rights not as one thing, but as a bundle of sticks that we have. And the optimal bundle can change over time with technology. And we can have things in what he calls a semi-commons. So sometimes, like free trade, as Angie said, would be the commons that we restrict but we allow in. Other things we don't. Fishing and so on. We restrict, and you've got rights within so many miles of your territory, and as you talk about underground seas. So I think there's that, but then going back to Coase, I think his fundamental insight was that all rights are redistributive. It's reciprocal. It doesn't mean it's equal, but if you restrict somebody, the pirates don't like it. You know, those guys in Somalia thought it was a good deal. And they're just using their power play to grab rights. Well, some other people don't think it's such a good deal. So Coase's view, which was granted normative, he said we should assign rights to the highest valued use. And then he goes through a whole series of law cases ad nauseum, almost all of them from Britain, about who should have the right. And it's about where is it the highest valued use? Because we usually can't always make the necessary side payments. But now there could be something that, I try not to use trumps this, supersedes it, is something that we just say, no, damn it, this is a sovereign issue. It's sovereignty. So it doesn't matter if the Philippines has a higher value for their fish or if China does. We're just saying the Philippines ought to or not have this right related to sovereignty, which we also, and I don't think you want to get into space, but there's better things with air before you get to space about, you know, people can't fly over our airspace. I mean, I wouldn't recommend them doing it with a military plane. They'd be shot down in, I've heard, 10 minutes. Something like that. So it's going to be fast. But if you fly over North Korea's space, you know, take a long time to know, and they don't have the capability. So people have sovereignty over their airspace by international treaties. But and that's this delicate balance now about power and coercion, which is a tricky one, right? Because you illustrated nicely with the China case, but all these ultimately are, with these international issues, how much coercion does the big guy in the block want to use, which was Pax Britannica after all. So I think it's really great as an economic historian how you start out with that historical perspective, and I encourage you to carry that through early on and then get us to where we're going, because I think along the way you can define the terms, you can talk about maritime law, which is historically British because the British were the strong guys on the block at the time, and then it's a historical path dependence. So I think it's got the great ingredients, and I'm trying to make it simpler for you, for a lay audience, so that this, unlike all my books, you know, you'd like to have somebody buy at the airport. Part of you does. Who doesn't want to write the book that people buy at the airport? But no, but this is an issue that I think is hugely topical, and you're there early, so you should capture that.
Mike, you're next in line.
Yeah, I got to say, on page 19 you have a sentence that I thought was really profound when I read it, and so let me quote it to you. The history of ocean governance is full of cross-currents and complexities that resist a simple narrative arc. Well, you are living that experience in this very session, right? You're getting a lot of alternative narratives to sort of present this, and you have to figure out what you want to emphasize. And we make two sort of points. A couple of them follow up on other things. One of them follows up on something else. Freedom of the seas is really a strange concept because it's really the outcome of a process of club formation and rule formation within club states as sort of a club of governments. And since it's a part of a club, there are rules associated with sort of where it applies and where it doesn't apply. And even in the height of when the British were in favor of free trade and freedom of the seas, they also were trying to restrict the slave trade. So there was an effort to sort of restrict behavior as well as so there's and Lee mentioned the thing about property being bundles of rights and things. Usually there's things that you're allowed to do and things you're not allowed to do, and those you can't have one without the other. And the story you're telling is not just a question of sovereign control by nation states or sovereign control by government as a whole. There's also private actors, there's also clubs. All these things are sort of involved in there. You need to have it. And one big missing piece, I think, in this is the role of technological change. And Lee started tacking into that really good. I want to follow up on that a little bit. Because you may claim a right to something, but if you can't actually get there and extract it, you don't have, I mean, in practical sense, you don't have it. And that's why the International Seabed Authority was so fascinating. They were trying to set up a global governance structure before anybody could even do the damn thing.
Yep.
Okay? And in the process, they made it prohibitively expensive to develop the technology and probably delayed it and stuff like that. But that was very unusual. Most of the time, the governance is trying to keep up with the technological change and various sorts of things like that. And so that's an important theme, that as technology changes and the capacity of naval forces change, more things become possible that weren't possible before. You know, let me give you one example, which I think is just fascinating. There's concern about overfishing in the open sea, and how do you control that? There's no way to control that. Well, it turns out now with some of this technology that we have now with GPS and cell phones and all those kinds of things, some nonprofit organizations are starting to monitor where these ships go and when they transfer, stuff like that. And so it may be possible to exert some global control over fishing in the seas without anybody saying we own this, but just you're doing behavior that's hurting the environment, and so you'll be shamed by people, or you'll be fined by this ISA or something similar to that. So, but that wasn't even conceivable originally. And if you go back far enough in time, freedom of the seas was just kind of by default. There was no way to control stuff going on in the middle of the ocean. Yep. And it wasn't a normative basis originally. It just was impossible to do anything else. And then it became a norm that was used and abused in various sorts of ways. It became a very political sort of concept, and people so there's a really fascinating story here about the interaction of technology and governance and state and global and normative and empirical. I think it'll be a great book, and if I see it in the airport, I'll buy it.
It'll be less than $100.
If it's less than $100.
Yeah, that's right.
Gustavo.
So I am Gustavo Torres from the Economic Department. So it's kind of, I have some overlaps with your points. So essentially, I was trying to figure out what would be the right framework to study your questions. I think that in the first chapter, I would really love to see it, that framework. I think it's you should to convince me, it would be something like this: describe and document what changes in the cost of appropriations. So the cost of appropriating the sea because of technological issues. Second, documents and try to convince me that there are changes in the benefits of appropriating the sea because of mining, fishing, blah blah. Then document that there is a change in the balance of power in the world and related to the sea. It doesn't matter if somebody with preferences exactly aligned to the US is gaining power. What matters is somebody with preferences completely misaligned with the US is gaining power. Yeah. Maybe China. That's what matters for that. And with that framework, I think you can have a positive theory of the political economy of the governance of the sea, which is going to be very clear and everybody will be able to follow. At the same time, you will be able to distinguish who are the potential winners or losers of these changes, and maybe say something about the normative stuff connected with environmental economics.
All right, Angie, I'm actually going to flag you, and I'm going to let David just take the last 5 minutes to wrap up and comment on whatever you want to comment on.
Okay. Wow. Stuff. That's a lot. Okay, so maybe I'm just going to pick kind of as things seem, as I seem able to respond. So, the issue of control versus what control means, I think it came up in a couple of different questions actually, and power. When I use the term, and I should be much clearer about this, I'm talking about legal right to space. And so the process of national appropriation has been a process of expanding legal rights to ocean space. Now, it's true that what that means in terms of actual control is going to vary widely. So the US, Europe, a number of states do a very good job of patrolling, knowing what's happening within their EEZ. Many states do not, and so that space is kind of uncontrolled in a certain sense, but there are still legal controls. So that's basically how I'm using that term. But that then segues into this issue of, and Mike was kind of mentioning this toward the end, about whether freedom of the seas is the default or whether it's something that has to be actively maintained. And I think that is a real, I hint at that a little bit, but I think it needs to be fleshed out a lot more, because I think my argument is it has to be actively maintained. It might, historically, it might have been the default in the sense that until we get to the Battle of, I think it's like the glorious 1st of June in 1806 or something, every battle before that, sea battle, is affiliated with a point of land, because they all took place close to land. Nobody could operate out, that far. And so we're only now getting to that point where, but I think freedom of the seas is a construct that has to be built and maintained. And the British, with various kind of caveats, did it. Whether the United States is willing to play that role, I think, is a big question mark. And if you look historically speaking, the United States, in a sense, galvanized the process of national appropriation with the Truman Proclamations in 1945. That was the U.S. that started that. And then everybody else followed on. So the U.S. role as kind of enforcer of freedom of the seas is very inconstant, I would say. But I do really believe it's something constructed and that has to be actively maintained. I think this idea of the bundle of rights is hugely important, because I try to separate those different elements of freedom of the seas, but you could imagine freedom of navigation becoming something we really insist on, but then freedom of fishing kind of disappears. And so, so I think getting in there that idea of the bundle of rights is something I should do a better job of. I think you had suggested that national appropriation is a problem for management of ocean resources. I think most people would say it as a boon for ocean resources. That the problem is when there isn't national appropriation in a sense. I mean, the 200 miles from the U.S. coast are much better governed and preserved because the U.S. controls it than they would have been if we were at a 12-mile territorial sea. And similarly, the waters off of Canada were wildly overfished by foreign fishing fleets, whereas having one sovereign control that, I think, increases the ability to manage that space. So I see the environmental resources argument bolstering the case for national appropriation overall, I would say. With some caveats, but I think that's where environmentalism leads us. I don't know, maybe you have a different view, but I think...
No, I think that's a convincing argument, but then the MPA thing, when they're international, gets a little messier.
Yeah, and that goes to the other point I wanted to address, which was, Ostrom would say, in my seminar on ocean governance, we've been talking about the Garrett Hardin kind of, either you make things private property or you have a coercive control from in this case, it would have to be kind of supranational. With Ostrom saying, no, there's this middle ground. And that middle ground is where a lot of these regional arrangements go, where there's a lot of stuff in that middle ground now, and the question is whether it's viable. And I think the record on these regional fishing RFMOs is very mixed, with a lot of them being totally ineffective and some of them being reasonably effective. But I think that's a big open question is whether that stuff in the middle is working or not.
Well, folks, with that, I want to thank you all for coming and thank David for his riveting presentation. For those of you who haven't got an opportunity, please sign the sign-in sheet. We're trying to track who arrives and who leaves. Please rest. And thanks so much. We look forward to seeing all of you next Monday.
Oh, thank you.
Well done. Oh my God, that was so much. Yes.
did introduce electronic.
Okay.
That was good.
It was good. They told me this format wouldn't work. When I first came, it was an hour and a half. And people talking for 45 minutes.
All right, well, here's
Here's the paper you should have.
Oh, now you tell me.
Your call will be disconnected.